This conversation is going to be a little bit different than some of the others in that we are looking in at the role of media. And my thinking is, if you're in this room, you probably don't wake up every morning instantly worried about affordable health care or the environment. If you're in this room, you're a governance geek and you wake up thinking about elections. And so we're going to talk today about the ways in which we rely on the media to help us think about elections, and the ways that we can support the media in covering elections well. And so before I introduce myself and everybody else, I just want a quick show of hands right quick. How many folks in this room are actively paying attention to election media coverage, let's say once a day? Keep your hands up twice a day. Keep your hands up 3 times a day. All right. Case in point, we've got an active audience that's engaged in this particular question. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on. I'm Heather Ballas. I'm the vice president of the Election Reformers Network, and I also do consulting for the Carter Center, all within the through the lens of how do we strengthen election governance in our country. I've got some brilliant people with me up here on the stage, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Immediately to my left is Pam Thessler, who recently retired from National Public Radio after more than 2 decades of reporting. I'm here in a little bit. She's going to introduce herself, and you're going to go, I recognize that voice. So wait for it. It's coming. I want to also mention that in her current work, though, she is with the elections group, and she published a publication that we're going to talk about today, which is an extensive guide for reporters on how to cover the 2024 elections. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Also with us is Sabrina Schaefer of the R Street Institute, and she is the vice president of public affairs at R Street and was prior to that, senior leadership with 2 different prominent public affairs firms in Washington, the White House Writers Group and the Herald Group. She's also a frequent media commentator, and we've seen her on CNN and Fox and C-SPAN. So we're really tickled to be hanging out with Sabrina. And then we also have Roop Raj, who has the unenviable position this morning of being the one working journalist on a panel with 3 tireless women that are trying to influence working journalists. And so he's agreed to be a good
wrong room, actually. I was at another meeting.
He's agreed to be a good sport and hang out with us. I want to let you know that in the 2 days that I've been in Michigan, I've been watching Mr. Raj's channel because we were hoping that you'd be on our panel. And I'm going to say, one, doing great work there, no question about it. But what Roop does at Fox 2 News in Detroit is he is the nightly news anchor and then also has a nightly political talk show, The Pulse. And he's also worked with local affiliates in Lansing and New Orleans, getting him FaceTime on CBS, ABC, and NBC. So you get my point when I say we've got some really terrific people that are here to talk with us today. So, Roop, we're going to start with you. And what I'm most interested in thinking about from the beginning is what you see as the biggest challenges in media in terms of covering elections today, and how that's different from the way we might have thought about it in past years.
That's a great question. I think the biggest issue that we face in terms of challenges in covering fairly these elections is simply asking the question, who says? And it's a basic tenet of journalism, but unfortunately the question's more complicated when you look at where we're at right now. Attribution is the key to, truth telling, and you have to at least tell whose truth are we telling, right? And so each and every day and each and every night, we get calls, whether it be from a state representative or a congressperson or most likely a PR person for one of those people, selling an idea and wanting that idea to show up on TV to influence people's minds. And by the way, I just want to give a little background. There's a lot of people who think their industries have evolved and somehow TV is a dinosaur and that only older people watch TV or whatever this notion is. These streaming capabilities that we have now in the connected TV, the same way people have Netflix and Amazon, they have Fox Local, which is an app in whatever city you're in. And so if you're in Milwaukee, many people are cable cutters who are watching Fox Local Milwaukee. In Detroit, it's Fox Local for Detroit. So the programming that we do, we have linear TV, so the ratings are seen on that, and then we have the streaming numbers, and then the web numbers, and all of that accounts for what we call impressions. So it's no longer Nielsen. That's changed in the last 6 months to a year. And so we subscribe to the impressions. Impressions means that last night, my Pulse, the television show that I do every night at 11:30, we doubled Colbert's ratings, we tripled the Tonight Show's ratings, and we beat our own 11 p.m. ratings last night at 11:30 p.m. And the reason that happened is because so many people are interested in, I believe, the kind of journalism that doesn't scream and yell at you, that tells people the truth as we know it according to the people that we talk to, and being clear in our attribution. And so our impressions this morning were quite good, and they will be, I think, until at least the election, if not more. Hopefully we'll gain trust and move on. But to answer the question and summarize that, I would say in a simplified way, the complexity that we face each and every day is trying to figure out who says it and what interests they have. And our job, which I don't think enough people do, is to not verify and report, but to rather verify that that's what someone said, then verify if it's true, and do that all in deadline. And I think another thing that we have to do is beat the temptation of being first. This 1985 version of being first is archaic, and it doesn't serve anybody well. And in this day and age of social media, when I don't trust social media, I don't trust the random neighbor of mine 4 houses down because he saw something about some conspiracy theory. I'm not going to believe that. So why then would I exercise the same lack of discipline that my neighbor 4 houses down did when I spent 28 years being a journalist? So we have to figure out a way to hold the horses and say it's okay to be last, but to be right. I hate to say it, but I know the cameras are rolling. My boss says, "Hey, how are you?" But I believe it, and they believe it too. I know that.
Very good. Thank you. So if being first isn't the only thing we have to think about, but we have to think about richness of content and accuracy of content. Pam, I know that that's been a real focus of your work. So talk to us a little bit about some lessons that you'd like to highlight in terms of your experience as a working reporter. And similar question, what do you think has really changed? What do you want this room to be thinking about? Knowing that, by the way, I bet you half the room is signed up already to be on a speakers bureau or trying to be a media commentary to be helpful to the press. So as you're giving your remarks, bear in mind, you've got a room that you can coach a little bit if you want.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to be here. So one of the things Heather mentioned is that I wrote this guide this year. So I worked at NPR for 28 years, and for 20 of those years, I covered voting issues. I covered them when nobody else actually really cared or was paying attention, just because I'm kind of a nerd, a policy nerd. But when I retired, I was very disturbed knowing all the things I know and knowing all the things that the last panelist spoke about, all the measures that are in place to protect and secure our elections and to make them fair, that the public trust after 2020 in our election results was so low. And I tried to figure out, well, what can I do? So one of the things I decided to do was the reason that public trust is so low is because the American public does not understand how our elections work. They're very confusing. People really didn't pay attention that much until the last few years, and that the media plays a crucial role in that education. And to do that, it's very important that the media or reporters who are covering this issue understand how the process works. And so I wrote this guide with the elections group. It's about 24 pages, and it includes lots of tips, how the process works, what are some of the key things to look out for, resources, links to resources, story ideas, and the hope is that if reporters can understand how the voting process works, they know who to talk to, who the trusted sources are, they know what questions to ask, that they will be able to identify when things are misinformation, and that they will be able to communicate to the public so the public will understand what is right, what is true and what is not true. And it is this lack of information about an understanding of our elections that, in fact, opens the way for all of these conspiracy theories to take place. I mean, if you don't know how ballots are counted, then you might be confused why, when you go to bed at night, it looks like one person is winning, and then 2 days later, you're told that somebody else is winning. So one of the main things that I include in this, I was trying to think of what the most important tip was, and that is for journalists to understand that, and people have talked about this before in earlier panels, that our elections are not perfect. There are going to be problems, and that the role of the media is to help the public understand what are big problems, what are minor problems, what are problems that are being fixed, what are problems that might not affect that many voters, what are not really problems. You have to understand, I don't know if you remember Sharpie Gate, where there were these conspiracy theories that in Maricopa County, that if you used a Sharpie pen, which is what they gave people, on your ballot, it would invalidate it. Well, you have to explain to people how the system works and what's. Anyway, so I'm hoping that most of this will at least help, knowing that there are a lot of reporters. The media itself is also under a lot of stress. We're losing reporters, we're losing media outlets, and there are going to be a lot of reporters, and there are a lot of reporters who will be covering this election or covering the voting process who are new to the process. And when you talk about the Speakers Bureau, it is very important that people are open to working with journalists and helping them navigate through this system and answering their questions and be open and transparent. I do think there's a lot more of that, but.
Well, we're going to come back and let you talk a little bit more about it. But let's jump for a second. Sabrina, you have two things you want to talk to us about. One is as a project that you have at R Street, and I want to come to that one in a minute. But you emailed me last night and said, I'd really like to talk to this room a little bit about sort of the history of how media shapes public opinion and how we're all influenced in different ways that we don't even realize. So Pam just talked a lot about factual information that we need to know, and that's a little bit different than how we know it and how we feel about it. What's our opinion about that? Do you want to elaborate on any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's on, right? And one of the things I was thinking about, actually, I was listening recently to a conversation, professor out of the University of Miami, Joseph Usinski, and he studies elections and he studies conspiracy theories, and it's fascinating research. And he was talking about how sort of in a typical time, and we are not living in a typical time, but in a typical time, maybe in the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 30 to 50% of voters who are on the losing side of an election assume that there was some kind of wrongdoing, that that the referee, so to speak, was not playing fair, and that's why they lost, not because their candidate was not the preferred candidate. And what's especially interesting in this sort of context is that people on the left love to assume that that's just on the right, and people on the right love to assume that's on the left. But the reality is, it is a very bipartisan sort of tendency. And so I think that is at first like sort of a helpful starting point when we're thinking about the role of media, because we are working with people who are naturally suspicious. I'm not quite sure how we got so suspicious, but yes, very, very, very concerned. But to sort of take a step back, yes, I think people sometimes wonder what the role of media is and how important they are in these conversations. And there's been a huge literature in the political science department, or the political science academics, on what shapes public opinion, especially when it comes to politics and views on elections. And the sort of common theme now is that public opinion or mass opinion is shaped by elite opinion. And so what someone hears on NPR is really important, because while they may not listen to NPR, the person who's loudest at the dinner table might, and they are going to espouse those ideas. And so sometimes people will say, well, what is the media now anyway? It's political commentators and it's reporters and it's people on social media. But the fact is those elite voices that we're hearing that are the loudest can really have a big impact on shaping people's views on the presidency, as well as on all sorts of public policy opinions. So I take the issue really seriously in that regard. And I think that we also have to remember that with that power comes great responsibility. And one challenge that I think we have all seen is that the media and campaigns for sure, but the media has often sort of contributed to sort of sowing some kind of discontent and fear. And no offense to either of my veteran reporters, but we know that sometimes this is a function of generating ratings. People like to tune in when, I'm guilty as charged for doom scrolling. You want to know how the world is falling apart. This morning, and I'm an avid NPR listener, so, but I was listening and they were teasing a program for later today on poll workers who are violence against poll workers, undoubtedly a real problem. But also the first thought I had was, oh my God, are these elections really going to be this bad? Is there going to be violence? Do I have to worry about going across the street to the elementary school where I vote? All of a sudden you kind of went from 0 to 10 and I didn't think I needed to, right? And so it just reminds you that these conversations, we want to contextualize them so that the public is not actually we're not fomenting fear and chaos in the public's mind.
Makes good sense. I want to shift for just a little bit to talk about the three, and Pam already talked a little bit about hers, but there's 3 different programs represented on this panel in terms of resources that are trying to be provided for journalists. And so, Sabrina, I'm going to let you keep the mic for just a second and tell us about yours. But before you do, we're going to do a tiny bit of insider baseball. And Kevin, the room is going to need the handout on our program from my part, and it's in the back of the room. Would you distribute while Sabrina's talking? And you tell us about yours, ma'am, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm with the R Street Institute, which is a national think tank headquartered in Washington. And we have many different policy programs, but we have one of my personal favorites is our governance program, and part of their work is on electoral reform. And one of the concerns was that after the 2020 election, when it was clear that so many Americans, over 50%, were expressing distrust in the 2024 election, and of that 25% of only 25% of Republicans expressed that they thought that their vote would be fairly counted in 2024. Our program decided that it was time to do some education. And so it's spearheaded by Matt Germer, who many of you in the room know. He is currently meeting with secretaries of state in Tennessee today to talk about his project. And one of the things that they've done is host convenings around the country, some bipartisan, some just with Republicans, to talk about the shared desire for safe and secure elections and how do we build trust in our elections? And so they last year put out this is sort of just a Xerox copy, but these conservative principles for building trust in elections. There's principles, and then there's also tactical things that can be done, some of which have already been discussed here this morning. But I think one of the big points that they make in here is that we don't need to have sort of there are going to be problems, to your point, Pam, right? There's going to be mishaps. That does not require that we sort of burn down the whole system, but that we are constantly engaging in sort of small levels of reform. And that if we do that and people feel like we're always tweaking on the margins, there's a sense that there's always room for improvement. And we're not saying there's no problems, but we don't have to start from scratch. So it's been a very successful program, and I hope you'll check it out on our website.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to talk next for a second about the one that you just now cleverly got the handout for. And that's called the Election Overtime Project. That's organized by the Election Reformers Network. And the intention there is to support reporters in covering the piece of the election that is that they have the hardest time with, and around which historically in the last couple of elections, we've had the greatest degree of misinformation about. Misinformation that's accidentally come from reporting, but misinformation that's also come from social media distributions and people themselves who just don't really understand those parts of the process. So our focus is on close, contested, and disputed elections and how reporters can cover them well. And so, and we focused on the states that are statistically most likely to have that particular problem. Those are the states that are battlegrounds, or states that are fake elector states, or states that are both. And so on the paper in front of you, you're going to see there's 7 states that we're zeroing in on. And for each of them, our team pulled together a detailed policy brief. We took those, 400 plus page election policy manuals that every state has, boiled it down to the areas that we are aware that journalists are most going to need to know about. And we talked to journalists along the way and said, which ones, this whole universe of stuff, what's most helpful to you? And boiled that down into what's actually about a 25 page report. But thankfully, thanks to the joy of the web, of the internet that lets you do those little accordions, you can hide a bunch of content. It looks like a small amount. So it's really digestible. And so it's easy to look at it. It's easy to figure out what you might need. You can click in, and then there's the extended content. We're really pleased to say that we've had attorneys and election officials in the different states help us review that content. So we're providing that as another example of some ways that there's materials available for journalists. And what that is that's different than what Pam's got is it's more about what they need to know. Now, what Pam gets into is why they need to know it and tactics for getting it figured out. So I wanted, just now that you've heard a little bit more about the others, I want to let you elaborate a little bit more on what's in your awesome 24-page book before we let Raj tell us what sounds helpful to him about these resources and what's got you worried about it. And there's your tip for what's coming next for you, sir. Go for it, Pam.
No, I was going to just say that certification of the elections it's a great example of just the type of thing that most journalists have no clue about who will be covering the election. This is the most, it's incredibly helpful to have this kind of information available. And basically what my guide is kind of directing them towards that information. But, one of the issues we have is that a lot of reporters who will be covering the certification, if an issue does arise, say like in Arizona or wherever, or Michigan or Georgia, especially, they might never have covered these elections before. They also might have 5 other beats that they have to cover. They might be covering, 20 stories in 1 week. They might also have to produce social media, and they need to have the tools immediately available to them to try and figure out what this information is and how to understand it, and then also how to convey it to the public. And that's why this is so useful. Now, one of the things that I did recommend in this guide, and it's a little late now, this came out in April, is that the reporters who might be covering this issue, go get to know their local election official now. Go there, learn the process, let them know who you are, exchange information, contact information, let them know how you do your jobs. I mean, that's one of the things. I've also worked with a lot of election officials, and they're always asking me, well, what does the media want? They don't understand often what the media needs and how they need information, and they need the information to be clear, understandable, no jargon. They also are on deadlines. They need people who are going to respond to their deadlines. So that's a lot of the stuff that we cover. But what you guys have done is really very, very helpful.
Likewise, ma'am, no question. All right, so here we are. We're saying to each other, we think it's very helpful, but we're not the working reporters that have to use it, right? So Raj, talk to us a little bit. What about what we all three have talked about seems useful to you? What worries you about it? And what recommendations do you have to the room about how we could all be supporting journalists and covering elections well, especially in complex times?
This is going to be frustrating to you because my answer is all of it, right? Because But here's the deal, though. I'm married to a mental health therapist, Julie, who always says it's not one thing. And so if you're angry, you're not just mad, you're frustrated and you're sad. If you're sad, you're maybe angry. I mean, she is available for office hours. But she always says, it's never that simple. And so whenever she's very good on stage, much better than me and much prettier than I am. And I said, go do some media. She goes, I refuse to do it. I said, why? She goes, I can't simplify things to 3 simple points. I'm not going to do it. So she only does long form media. And I respect that about her. It's very insulting to what I do every night, but whatever, we're paying the bills together. So it's nice. But I think everything that you said is helpful. Now, here's the deal. I mean, I want to grab one of those and maybe more than one and go to my newsroom and talk to everybody who's going to be covering elections. The more information we have about how things work and how things are done, the more helpful it's going to be. That being said, it's also critical to do what you just heard them say, which is to go and talk to clerks. Understand what these election clerks are dealing with on election day, and don't wait for election night to figure it out. I think that reactive nature of broadcast journalism is sexy and fun when you're on election night and you're able to say, hey, we just heard something or we have new information. But I think it's really, really important. The sexiest part for me is good journalism. So that means being thorough beforehand and understanding, like me just sitting in on this panel. I'm really grateful to be here and learn from you. And I mean, I'm not just saying that. And so when I walk away with that, I want to help educate my reporters. One thing I think is really important, journalists in the community have to have better relationships. And that is going to be a complicated algorithm to work through, because I think there's so many journalists who put on this armor as though they're on the defense. They don't want to sit down with community members and they're always defensive. And if my thing is like, I criticize the hell out of the media. You should. I do. Right. I mean, I watch the media just like I'm a part of it, but I watch it and I'm always rolling. You could probably hear me rolling my eyes in my Southfield TV station, because when I watch the media, I'm going, no, that's an oversimplification. That's not true. That's not accurate. That's not 100% true. But the solution to that for me has always been building relationships and understanding who is good at building relationships. Because let's face it, it's like a mentor. Not everyone wants to mentor you, right? But there's going to be a clerk in your local community that is willing to sit down with you over coffee or lunch and really help you understand how things work. And when I was in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, some of the elections that took place, there was a lot of questions about what's really going on here. People are frustrated and angry. And excuse me, I went and sat down with a bunch of clerks from different little areas like Gretna and Marrero and Slidell and these little cities and say, hey, how does it work at the grassroots level? And that way, when I'm out in the air anchoring the news, I can explain it with the context that's important, because context is everything. But the next most important thing, you can't just blame the media. These clerks have to understand the importance of being transparent. And so one thing I'll give credit to our Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson here. I have a really good relationship with her. I have her cell phone. We text probably weekly. Her press person was hired out of a television station in Grand Rapids. So that woman understands when a young reporter who doesn't understand what's going on and calls on deadline, Sherry will then say, hold on, I've been where you were at. I know what you're asking. Let me check. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, I texted Sherry. The days go by quickly. It was actually like beginning of the week, maybe end of last week. But it was all about Ted Kennedy, or RFK rather, appearing on the ballot and in Michigan, and whether or not he would or wouldn't. And this was, again, 4 days ago. And when I texted her, she says, it's not that simple. I can't just text you back and answer. I'll have so-and-so call you back. And taking the time for a half hour to sit down with a notebook and a pen and really try to understand what's going on, those relationships are critical. I think that's a big part of it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just add one quick thing. I mean, you said like, basically going and having this trusting relationship. One of the best stories and most enlightening stories for me when I was covering voting was I had an election official in, it was Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, and it was during COVID. And I said, I really want to come in, and they were being inundated with mail ballots. And I said, I just want to, what are your obstacles that you're facing? He said, come on up. And I think it was partly because he already trusted me, and he gave me free rein to go into his office and spend all day long in there behind the scenes talking to all the workers, watching them opening mail, the phone calls that they were getting, and just to be there and see all of the challenges that they faced. It was at the end of my career, actually, but I still will remember every single thing, the people, the mail that they got. It was really quite extraordinary.
Wouldn't you say through osmosis comes understanding? It's not
Right.
just knowing facts and it's sitting with someone, it's watching them do their work. That's really cool.
Right. And I especially remember this one woman whose whole job was to go through obituaries and figure out who, going of the voter rolls. They had it all in cards, in these drawers. And she would go through every day the local newspapers, and she'd double check with state records, but her job was to update those records every single day. And she talked about one day it was her father's obit that she had to remove her father from the voter rolls. And I just will never forget that.
Goodness. I'm pausing for a minute because that's such a moving story that this woman experienced.
It
But
humanizes
right,
who these
exactly,
election workers
right.
are.
Absolutely. I am going to shift and I'm going to provide one quick example of coverage, election coverage, and I'm going to ask each of you to give me like a quick 30-second response about how we could have reacted to this coverage. And I'm giving you that heads up that it's going to be quick, because then we're going to turn to you all and use the last of our time for some questions from the audience. But the example I'm going to give you was an article that ran last week in The Guardian. And the piece was on election certification, and it was well-intentioned media coverage with well-intentioned sources. And Adam Kinzinger is the fellow who was quoted, and that's former congressman, courageous person who stood up to his party and took positions that were around accuracy in the last election. But he said this, look at Arizona, for instance. Let's assume Arizona goes for Kamala, but it's a Republican legislature. The legislature has to be the one to certify Kamala as the winner. According to the Constitution, if the state legislature decides it's just going to certify Trump, even if its voters went the other way, we'd have to accept that in the federal government. Now, everybody on this panel knows that that's actually everything that I just read to you is inaccurate. It is, well-intentioned, but inaccurate. Tammy Patrick, bless her heart, is shaking her head over here like I started the sentence and she's like doing this, right? And there's a reason for that. So the first thing I want to do is give folks up here a chance to weigh in on either what can reporters do better to to be able to fact check and not have this kind of a situation in place, or what can we as the people who are trying to support good press do to help reporters have what they need in advance or be able to respond well when we accidentally do get something out in the public that is as wildly inaccurate as what I just read. And you guys can take that in whichever order you want.
I feel a little bit vulnerable sitting in between two journalists, but I would say that I am a little concerned that a reporter who covers elections and presumably an editor who edits that content, that nobody caught that, and nor that anybody suggests collaborating it with or corroborating it, with another source, or identifying several other sources that would verify it. So while yes, at our street, we talk a lot about assuming good intent. I do assume good intent, but sometimes, as in all fields, the media can be terribly sloppy, and I think we have to be very careful about that, because as we talked about earlier, trust in our institutions, and not just our government institutions, but our civic institutions as well, has plummeted. And in fact, the Pew Research Center recently released data where it said only 21% of Americans trust American newspapers. So I think these kinds of instances actually can have quite a long-lasting impact if we're not careful.
I guess I would just say that two things. it goes back to that it's too bad that that reporter who was covering this issue hadn't done sort of the groundwork ahead of time so that he would have asked questions about that comment from the congressman. I think secondly, I'm curious now that this has been published, has anybody tried to reach the reporter to correct it? To correct the information. And I think that that's the type of thing that most of you could be involved in, because sometimes people just say, oh, this is terrible, they misreported something, but they never tell the reporter. And I always wanted to know if I made a mistake. But sometimes people thought, well, okay, it was intentional. The reporter did it intentionally. So I think it's very important to follow up with reporters. And again, also to reach out to those reporters who will be covering these issues and say, hey, I'm here. And I can help.
Yeah, that's great.
I think strong assertions from, you can hear me, we're all in the same room. Strong assertions from anybody deserve scrutiny. I just think that anytime someone comes to you strongly with something, you need to question it. Even, you have to have the courage to ask the follow-up, which is, how do you know that? Why are you saying this? And not feel like you're being a jerk. I mean, part of being a reporter and a journalist is asking a question. I mean, I do a nightly talk show, and whether it be the Secretary of State or whether it be whoever it is, they know, the mayor of Detroit, they know that when they're on my show, I'm going to ask questions that make them uncomfortable. My job is not to make you feel okay. My job is to get the truth. And I think you can do it with decorum and an understanding that we're not here to protect a candidate's feelings or a politician's feelings. We're here to protect the truth. And that sounds all pie in the sky, but really that is when I wake up in the morning, what I think about and what I go to sleep thinking about as well. And if I ever even have an impression from a viewer that I've done something like that, I get so upset because I think, my goodness, my trust is so important. They shouldn't feel this way. But I think if I was interviewing Representative Kinzinger, to make such a wild assertion, even if, let's say I didn't know the answer, be curious enough to ask how and why. And I think those are basic journalism questions that we need to kind of get into and get deeper into.
Good,
Prepares
thank you.
you really well is having 3 teenagers at the dinner table every night. We cannot say one thing without them saying, "Are you? That's not true. That's not true." And then my husband's sitting there looking something up to provide a source for fact checking our own conversations every night.
Every day. All right. So fact check, yes. Who out here has a question for these smart people? Yep, Scott. Adrian's bringing you a mic. One sec, sir.
Hi, I'm Scott. Is this on? Yeah. There we go. I'm Scott Konopasek. I was an election official for 30 years in 4 different states. And Pam, I met you back in California, Nevada, when you were covering the adoption of DREs. That's a flashback, isn't it? But I've always been impressed by you taking the time to really understand and educate yourself about what the issues were and to fairly report. And it's very obvious over the years in all your reporting on elections topics that you took the time to prepare. And I think your comments today reflect that. My experience with the media in doing elections is been that I usually get a cub reporter who is sent out blind from an assignments desk to come cover some important election story. And I had to spend a lot of time training and bringing them up to speed and giving them background so they could effectively do their job. And if I hadn't done that, the quality of their reporting would have been affected. So the media has medical reporters, medical experts, technology niche reporters. They have legal analysts and reporters. What's the prospect, do you think, of the media coming up in with a specialization in their field or in their bureaus or in their media outlets for having people who actually develop an understanding of the election processes so they can more completely and accurately do the job of informing voters?
That's a great question. And I think unfortunately, because the media industry is seeing so much contraction, so many local outlets especially are just disappearing. A lot of news organizations, the reporters that they do have, I mean, even NPR has cut back substantially. So that's the bad part, because I think then you're going to have fewer people. I was lucky because I had the luxury of spending time, or like going to Lehigh County and spending all day long there, which is not really a lot of news organizations. People just do not have that time because they're under the demands are so high. The good news is I've noticed, especially for this election, and when I've been doing a lot of work promoting this guide, I've been working with the Poynter Institute, the American Press Foundation, the National Press Foundation. A lot of news outlets are very interested in this topic, and they do have, I'm seeing more and more having reporters who are devoted to it and who want to learn the process in a way that never didn't exist before 2016 at all. So I am actually very hopeful that I'm very hopeful actually that there will be more media resources devoted to this particular topic, partly because everybody now realizes how crucial it is. I think that the negative side, the bad side, and the other bad side is that, we just, when you talk about the media, what is the media, right? And where do you get news information? And social media just dominates, and you have so much opinionated media, or, and it's so hard for the public to figure out what is the source that they should trust the most. But that's a whole different topic.
And when I'm going to let you jump in, but I'm going to say we are supposed to turn this group loose so that we can eat lunch. So what I'm going to recommend that we each do is let's take 30 seconds of closing down the line and let us share with this room our final takeaway, or the thing that we most want people to talk to us some more about at lunch. And you get to go first.
So we don't get to do what Trump and Kamala Harris did the other night and just kind of, instead of answering the question, go into their talking points. So I'll just say it's a great way to end it for me. First of all, thank you for being here and being interested and giving us the opportunity to speak to you. It's an honor. Thank you. I just think that, so out of the 32 reporters and anchors at my TV station, 10 of us have been there for 25 years, or 15 to 25, 30 years. We don't have that issue. And I know that my competition, with all due respect, I believe in healthy competition. I don't like that the other companies are contracting and doing that kind of work where they're trying to save money. I think when people demand good journalism, corporations listen. I think that it's good to write and to tell these organizations that employ people like us that good local journalism is important and that we need people that know what they're doing. And if they continue to make investments and not make people rich by being anchor people and reporters, but make them comfortable and allow them to live a good life, people will invest back in their communities in a great way. So I would encourage you, because this is America and corporations are listening to you. So you go talk to them and say, I want good local journalism. It works. And again, we're an example, 32 anchors and reporters, no layoffs this year, no layoffs last year. We do, a 9-hour morning show, and I do 4.5 hours of news, 5 shows a night. And I have a full throttle of reporters, photographers, and veterans who are working with us. So demand good journalism and you'll get it, but you have to demand it.
It's great. Thank you, sir. Sabrina.
I guess the issue that I would still like to talk about maybe at lunch is the role that the media is playing in sort of increasing political polarization and its coverage of elections. And I will just sort of put the teaser out there that I'm actually sort of somewhat of a fan of political polarization. And so if we have time at lunch, I would love to talk to everyone about that.
Good. Thanks. Pam?
I guess the only other thing I would like to hear back from people about what they see as kind of the failings of the media and how they think the media could do a better job in covering elections. So I'm open.
Good. And what I'm going to say, because I'm the person who seems to have the microphone and drop websites, that seems to be my role last night and tonight, is that everyone here can get more information on the Election Overtime Project at electionovertime.org. And if you are someone who is in